Under a sky the color of cold iron, she knelt in the brittle grass, hands sunk in wet earth. The mound before her was fresh, the soil clumped and dark from last night's rain. A crude wooden cross, cut from the splintered remains of their barn door, leaned slightly to one side. She carved his name into it with the tip of a kitchen knife until the blade dulled, each stroke catching on the grain. Her 2 children stood close, their faces drawn and hollow, the wind tugging at their threadbare clothes. The boy's hand clutched her skirt, as though afraid the ground might open and take her too. There was no prayer, no hymn, only the long whistle of wind sweeping across the open prairie. The grass bent and whispered, and somewhere far off, a lone crow broke the silence with a harsh, ragged cry. She pressed her palm to the mound, not in farewell. Farewells were for people who believed in gentler things, but in acknowledgment. He was gone. The land remained, and the land was cruel. The sound of wagon wheels cut through the wind. She turned before she could stop herself, squinting against the glare of low sun. A covered wagon lumbered toward her from the west, pulled by a pair of mules whose ribs pressed against their hides. The man on the bench seat was tall, his face fixed in a mask of impatience, the brim of his hat pulled low. His wife sat beside him, thin-lipped, arms folded tight against her chest. Behind them, 2 boys, nearing manhood, rode horseback, the glint of steel from their rifles catching the light. The wagon stopped a few yards away. Dust hung in the air between them. The man didn't dismount. He only looked at her, at the grave, then at the children. "Ain't no point you staying here," he said, voice flat. "This place needs a man's hand. Ain't yours to run." She rose slowly, every joint aching from too many nights on the floor, and too many days bent over a shovel. "It was my husband's," she said, keeping her voice low. The wife replied sharply, leaning forward. "Now he's in the ground, and you got no claim. We'll take care of the place." Her eyes flicked to the boy and girl. "You'll be better off elsewhere." The older boy on horseback grinned faintly, as if this was entertainment. The younger shifted in his saddle, but said nothing. The man clicked his tongue and gave a small nod. His sons swung down from their horses. She stepped forward, planting herself between them and the doorway of the small cabin. The younger of her children pressed into her hip. The older's eyes darted from face to face, trying to measure the danger. They didn't push her aside, not yet. Instead, they began pulling tools from the shed, rope from the barn, the small store of salted meat she'd hidden beneath a tarp. She wanted to shout, to tell them they were thieves, but the words stuck like burrs in her throat. One of the boys led their single milk cow toward the wagon, its hooves leaving deep prints in the wet ground. Another hauled away the barrel that caught rain from the roof. When there was nothing left worth taking, the man spoke again. "Don't think you can stay. This ain't your land, and it sure ain't safe for a woman alone." She held his gaze. "I have nowhere to go." "Then keep walking till you find somewhere." He flicked the reins, and the wagon creaked forward. His wife didn't look back. The boys mounted up again, rifles across their laps, and followed. In moments they were nothing but silhouettes against the horizon. The prairie was too quiet after they'd gone. She gathered what she could carry: a worn canvas sack, a wool blanket, a tin cup, the revolver her husband had kept above the door. It had only 1 bullet. The weight of it in her pocket was both comfort and curse. She slung the sack over her shoulder, took her younger child in her arms, and told the older to keep close. The sun was already sliding toward the west. They walked until their shadows stretched long and thin over the grass. The air grew colder, the wind sharper. The boy stumbled more than once, his boots too worn to keep out the damp. She kept moving, her mind fixed on the thin line of trees she'd spotted hours earlier. Shelter, maybe, or at least a break from the wind. By the time they reached the trees, the light was nearly gone. The ground here was uneven, tangled with roots and half-hidden stones. She found a small hollow where the earth dipped and set the children down. Their faces were pale and slack with exhaustion. She wrapped the blanket around them and tried to coax them to eat, but the little bread they had was hard as stone. They chewed in silence, eyes heavy. The wind moved differently here, less fierce, more watchful. She could hear it sifting through the branches, carrying with it the faint rustle of grass beyond the tree line. It wasn't the steady sway of wind alone. It was irregular, measured. She froze, listening. Somewhere beyond the darkness, something shifted. A faint creak, like leather stretched over wood. The sound of breathing that wasn't hers or the children's. She peered into black between the trees, her eyes straining to find shape in shadow. Nothing moved. She told herself it was the wind again, or perhaps some deer nosing through the undergrowth. Still, her hand slid into her pocket, curling around the revolver's worn grip. The cold metal made her skin ache. They would sleep here tonight, and in the morning they would keep walking. Where to, she didn't know, but she had no choice. The land was wide, and the dark was deep, and somewhere out there, the world still turned. Above them, the stars began to appear, first one, then another, until the sky was littered with them. She leaned back against the trunk of a tree. The children pressed to either side of her. The wind shifted again, and she thought, just for a moment, she saw a shadow move at the edge of the trees. She didn't look twice. Not tonight. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The morning broke thin and gray, the kind of light that made the prairie look endless and unforgiving. Frost clung to the grass, turning each blade into a needle. She rose stiffly, every muscle aching, the revolver still cold in her pocket. The children stirred under the blanket, their breath rising in small clouds. She coaxed them to their feet with soft words, though her voice felt worn thin. They walked without speaking, the wind dragging at their clothes, the sky overhead an unbroken sheet of pale cloud. By midday her lips were cracked, and the younger child's steps had slowed to a stubborn shuffle. Hunger was a low, constant ache, but thirst was worse. Each swallow was an effort. She knew there was water somewhere west, though the exact distance was a guess. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder, a habit he'd picked up since they left the trees. She noticed it, too, that sense of not being alone. Once, she thought she saw a dark shape on the horizon, low against the grass. Too far to tell if it was a rider or a trick of the land. She told herself it didn't matter. If danger was coming, she'd meet it when it arrived. By the third day, the younger child was feverish. Her skin burned under the touch, eyes half closed as she swayed in her mother's arms. The boy walked ahead, scanning the ground for anything edible, a stray patch of berries, a rabbit too slow to flee. But the prairie gave nothing. When the sun dropped low, she set the girl down and tried to build a fire from brittle grass and a few dead branches. It burned low, spitting smoke. That night, the wolves came. She heard them before she saw their eyes, low, guttural calls threading through the darkness, growing closer. The children pressed against her, the fire between them and the shadows. She pulled the revolver from her pocket and held it in both hands, arms steady despite the tremor in her chest. There was only one bullet. She thought of saving it for the last moment, when teeth were on them, when there was no other choice. The wolves stayed just beyond the reach of the firelight, pacing. Now and then one would step forward, its shape caught in the glow, before melting back into darkness. She did not sleep. When morning came, the wolves were gone, but the sense of being watched had not left. They moved on, the wind at their backs, the land rolling out in slow, unending waves. By mid-afternoon, she spotted the shimmer of water. Relief pushed her forward, though caution kept her steps measured. The stream was narrow but deep, its surface rippling with the current. She cupped water in her hands and drank until her stomach cramped, then let the children do the same. The sound of hooves broke the stillness. She turned sharply, her body shielding the children. 2 riders approached, their horses lean but fast. They reined in a short distance away, grinning as though they'd found something worth their time. Both were unshaven, their clothes torn and dusty, rifles slung casually across their backs. "You look lost," the taller one said, his voice oily with mock kindness. "We could help." She didn't answer. The shorter man nodded toward the children. "A woman and 2 little ones. Out here alone? That's dangerous. We could take you somewhere safe." Her grip tightened on the revolver. "We're fine." The tall one swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the soft earth. "Fine's not what I see. I see a woman with no food, no shelter, and no man to keep her company. His smile didn't reach his eyes. We're offering charity. The other dismounted as well, moving toward the boy. The revolver came up in her hand, the barrel steady. Best you keep back, she said. The tall one laughed. You gonna shoot us both with that one bullet? Her finger found the trigger, but she hesitated, calculating. If she missed, if she only wounded, there'd be nothing left to protect the children. The shorter man lunged forward, and she fired. The shot cracked across the water, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. The bullet missed by inches, biting into the dirt at his feet. He froze for a moment, startled, then grinned. Guess you're empty now. Before he could take another step, an arrow hissed through the air and buried itself in his shoulder. He screamed, stumbling backward. The tall man spun, searching the horizon. From the crest of a hill, a lone rider descended, horse pounding the earth, hair bound in a single braid that whipped behind him. Another arrow flew, striking the ground between the tall man's boots. Both men scrambled for their horses, the wounded one cursing through clenched teeth. They rode hard, disappearing over the rise they had come from. The rider slowed as he neared, his bow still in hand, another arrow notched. His eyes swept over her, then to the children, then back to the trail where the men had fled. He said nothing. The horse shifted under him, muscles twitching in the cold air. He studied her for a moment longer before swinging down in one smooth motion. His presence was quiet but certain, like someone accustomed to moving unseen until the moment he chose otherwise. She didn't lower the revolver, though it was now useless. He unhooked a leather water pouch from his saddle and held it out. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mockery in it, no greed. She took it without a word, letting the boy drink first, then the girl. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of stone. When she tried to hand it back, he shook his head. Then he looked at the children again, a quick, assessing glance, before turning to his horse. He mounted without effort, as if the weight of the bow and quiver were nothing. For a heartbeat, she thought, he would ride on and vanish into the horizon. Instead, he waited, the horse facing west, his gaze fixed on something far beyond sight. She realized, then, that he was not offering the water alone. He was offering direction. Her mind flicked through the dangers, what she didn't know of him, what she did know of the land. But she also thought of the bandits, of the wolves, of the in-laws who had cast her out as though she were nothing. She glanced down at the children. The boy was staring at the rider, curiosity cutting through his weariness. The girl's head rested against her shoulder, eyes half closed, cheeks flushed with fever. When she looked back, the rider was still there, waiting. Without speaking, she stepped forward. He turned the horse and started west. She followed. The sun slid lower as they walked, the rider ahead cutting a steady path through the rippling grass. His pace was deliberate, neither hurried nor slow, as if he had measured the land and decided exactly how much of it they would cross before nightfall. She kept the children close, the revolver hidden in her pocket, though she knew it was now only a weight, not a weapon. When the wind shifted, she caught the scent of smoke, thin, far away. The rider's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring, and then he adjusted course without a word. She wondered if the smoke meant people, and if people meant safety or danger. The boy asked nothing, but she saw his gaze fixed on the quiver of arrows across the rider's back, his curiosity tempered by caution. The girl clung to her mother's skirt, her small steps dragging. Near dusk, the rider halted by a stand of cottonwoods. He swung down from his horse, looped the reins loosely over a branch, and began clearing a space on the ground with the heel of his boot. She hesitated, unsure if this was an invitation or an order. His eyes met hers, and he gave a small tilt of his chin toward the spot. She understood they would stop here. She set the children down, unwrapping the blanket to spread it on the earth. The rider unpacked a small bundle from his saddlebag, a strip of dried meat, a pouch of grain, a tin pot. Without speaking, he built a fire, his movements efficient, almost soundless. She watched the way his hands worked. Swift, sure, each gesture necessary and nothing wasted. When the fire caught, Its light painted his features in gold and shadow. His face was weathered but young, eyes dark and steady. He handed her the dried meat first, and she passed it to the children. The boy tore into it hungrily. The girl nibbled, her fever making her slow. He poured grain into the pot, filled it with water from his pouch, and set it over the fire. The scent of cooking was almost unbearable after so many days of hunger. She forced herself to wait until he handed her a portion. The food was simple, but it steadied her. She thanked him quietly, though she wasn't sure he understood the words. He drew a small shape in the dirt with a stick, a circle surrounded by short lines radiating outward. She guessed it was the sun. Then he drew a wavy line beneath it, and beside that, the shape of a teepee. He tapped the teepee and then pointed west. His meaning was clear. They were heading toward his home. She nodded but felt a tightness in her chest. His people might welcome him, but her? A white woman with 2 children? She had no illusions about the divisions on this land. Still, the choice was not hers to make. The alternative was to walk alone into a country that had already tried to starve her. The boy, bolder than she, pointed to the quiver of arrows and mimed shooting one. The rider's mouth curved into the faintest smile. He reached for his bow, held it out, and let the boy feel its weight. The child's eyes widened. He did not draw it, perhaps sensing instinctively that it was not a toy, but his shoulders straightened as if some small piece of strength had passed between them. When the meal was finished, the rider rose and moved beyond the firelight, his silhouette merging with the dark. She heard him circling the camp's edge, the faint creak of leather, the whisper of grass under his boots. It occurred to her he was not merely cautious. He was guarding them. She lay down between the children. The blanket pulled over all 3. The fire cracked softly. Above, the stars burned sharp and countless. Sleep came slowly, tangled with thoughts she couldn't untangle. Gratitude, fear, and a quiet realization that she trusted him more than she should. At first light, they were moving again. The fever in the girl had worsened, her head lolling against her mother's shoulder. The rider noticed. He stopped, rummaged through his saddlebag, and pulled out a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were dried herbs, their scent sharp and clean. He poured some into his palm, gesturing for water. She filled a tin cup from his pouch, and he dropped the herbs in, swirling until the water darkened. He handed it to her with a nod. She held it to the girl's lips. The child sipped reluctantly, but after a moment, her eyes closed in something like relief. It was the first sign of ease she'd shown in days. They pressed on through rolling ground. Once, they spotted riders far in the distance, 3 of them, crossing the ridge. The rider ahead slowed, watching them until they disappeared. His body seemed to sharpen, as if every sense had tuned to danger. She matched his pace without complaint. That night, the fire was smaller, shielded by a curve in the land. The rider sat with his back to the wind, bow across his knees. She studied the line of his jaw in the firelight, the way his gaze never rested on one thing for long. He was not just leading them. He was reading the land for threats she could not see. She found herself speaking, voice low, so the children would not wake. She told him about the grave, the in-laws, the way they had taken everything but the ground she stood on. She didn't expect him to understand all the words, but he listened, his eyes fixed on hers in a way that made her feel the weight of them. After a long silence, he spoke, halting, careful. "My wife, my son, taken, long time." His hand moved across his chest in a slow arc, ending with fingers curling into a fist. She didn't need more words to understand. Something shifted in the space between them then, not trust exactly, but recognition, the knowledge that both had been cut open by loss, and both still carried the scar. The wind rose, rattling the grass. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called. The rider looked toward the sound, then back to her. His voice was quiet but certain. "We go. Soon." She nodded, knowing that whatever waited ahead was not just his home. It was the next edge of their survival. By late afternoon, the land had begun to change, rising in gentle swells that broke the horizon, dotted with cottonwoods and the dark smudge of smoke in the distance. The rider paused on a ridge, scanning the valley below. She saw it then, a river cutting silver through grass, its banks green and soft. Beyond it, faint against the fading light, were the sharp points of lodges. Her chest tightened. It was the first place in days that looked like it could hold them, the first place she could imagine stopping. The girl stirred in her arms, murmuring in her sleep, the fever still clinging but lighter than before. The boy walked a step ahead, his shoulders straighter now, though his clothes hung looser from the days of hunger. The rider glanced back at them once, his gaze resting on the girl before he turned his horse toward the slope. They followed without speaking. They were halfway down when the sound reached them, distant at first, then swelling, hooves, fast and many. She stopped, listening. The rider slowed his mount, head turning toward the east. Over the crest of a far rise, figures appeared. Riders, 5, maybe 6. The sunlight caught on rifle barrels. Her breath tightened in her throat. She recognized 2 of them instantly. The bandits from the stream, the one she'd nearly shot, and the other with the arrow scar on his shoulder. Riding with them, unmistakable even at distance, was her husband's older brother. The sight of him made her stomach clench. Hat pulled low, jaw set, eyes locked forward like a man who had already decided her fate. The rider said nothing, but his horse shifted beneath him, muscles bunching for movement. She understood. They would not reach the river before the others closed in. The first shot cracked through the air, striking the earth a few yards ahead. The boy flinched. The rider wheeled his horse, bow in hand, and sent an arrow slicing toward the lead rider. It struck his arm, spinning him sideways in the saddle. The others shouted, spurring their mounts faster. "Run!" she told the boy, shoving him toward a cluster of boulders near the bank. She followed, the girl clutched tight. The rider moved with them, his bow a constant motion, draw, loose, draw again, arrows hissing through the air. 2 riders broke off, circling to cut them off from the water. She reached the rocks and set the girl down, the boy crouching beside her. The rider slid from his saddle, letting the horse bolt toward the river. He drew a knife, its blade curved and bright in the sun. One of the in-laws' sons was the first to reach them, rifle swinging toward the rocks. She grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him down as the shot blasted splinters from the stone. Before the rider could move, she snatched up the rifle that had fallen from the wounded bandit's hand nearby. The weight was strange, heavier than she expected. She had never fired anything larger than the revolver, but there was no time for thought. When the next rider charged, she aimed low and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the shot struck his leg, knocking him sideways. He fell hard, the horse bolting past. She didn't know if he would live, and she didn't care. Her brother-in-law dismounted, advancing with deliberate steps, pistol raised. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Should have stayed gone," he said, voice cutting through the chaos. She stood, the rifle in her hands, her heart pounding so hard it filled her ears. "You took everything," she said. "Not this." He raised a pistol. She fired first. The shot took him in the chest. He staggered, disbelief etched on his face, then crumpled into the grass. The sound of the fall seemed to drain the fight from the others. One of the bandits shouted something sharp, and the surviving riders turned their horses, retreating toward the horizon with the dust of their flight hanging behind them. The silence that followed was thin and brittle. The rider lowered his bow, but did not relax until the last figure vanished from sight. Then he looked at her, eyes lingering on the rifle in her hands before dropping to man in the grass. His expression did not change, but something in it acknowledged the cost of what she'd done. The boy emerged from behind the rocks, wide-eyed but steady. The girl clung to her mother's leg, her fevered face pressed into the fabric of her skirt. The rider gestured toward the river. She understood they would cross now while there was still light. They moved together, the water cold around their ankles, the current tugging at their steps. On the far bank, the smoke smell was stronger, mingled with a faint sense of cooking meat and wood. Shapes began to emerge from between the lodges, figures watching their approach, still as carved wood. When they reached solid ground, the rider went ahead, speaking in a low voice to the first man who stepped forward. The stranger's gaze flicked to her and the children, unreadable. After a moment, he nodded, and the circle of watchers loosened. She felt the children draw closer as they followed the rider into the heart of the camp. The light was fading, the sky bleeding into violet and gold. Somewhere, a drumbeat began, slow, steady, like a heartbeat under the earth. The rider stopped at the edge of an empty space near the fire pits and turned to face her. For the first time since she had met him, he spoke more than a single word. "Safe here," he said. She nodded, unable to speak past the weight in her throat. He looked at her a moment longer, then at the children, before stepping back into the firelight. She watched him go, the bow across his back, his shadow stretching long over the ground. The boy slid his hand into hers. The girl leaned against her, eyes already closing. For the first time since the grave, she let herself breathe without fear. And still, somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, the prairie waited, wide and open and watching.